Nikki Javal with The Athletic. Just for both of you, just looking back over this past season, how would you assess the work that Cliff did with the offense?
Yeah, we're going through all the coaches, Cliff offensively, defensively, on the teams wide. And so that's really what we're digging into, Nikki, to find what's best. How do we do it? Where do we find spaces to improve? And, for Cliff, for Joe, for Larry, for all of us, like, that's our main focus. Like, so we're never in this space again. And that's what we want to dig in hard on.
Yeah. Some context there. Dan Quinn did say before the press conference began that he and Adam Peters wouldn't be answering any questions about changes to things like coaching staff members. But Nikki didn't ask him about whether or not Cliff was going to stay on as the offensive coordinator. Nikki asked him about the job he did this year. The no answer to that question was very telling. Easy opportunity to endorse the Cliff Kingsbury season this year. He did not do that. That is a major red flag. Stay tuned. Who knows? Diana Rossini was the first to report it. Ben had some reporting over the weekend about Cliff potentially not being here as whether or not he gets a head coaching job not being even the real issue. The one thing in Diana's report that I mentioned yesterday that I thought was important is that she wrote the Commanders likely won't make any final decisions until they see how the broader coaching market develops, meaning who's out there to replace Cliff Kingsbury. Well, at this point, Kevin Stefanski is out there and available. But there's a lot of discussion that Kevin Stefanski is going to get a head coaching job, whether it be in Atlanta or New York. There may be others, and there may be somebody that they believe in that's on the staff. I would doubt that. I would think it would be an outside hire to replace Cliff Kingsbury if they move on from him. But this is something to certainly keep an eye on, not only today, like in the immediate, imminent future, but throughout the week. Good morning, everybody. Max is here with me. The Wizards are reportedly in the market potentially for Trey Young. Could be a blockbuster trade. Now, if you're an NBA fan, you're probably not like, oh, wow, Trey Young to the Wizards. No, it's not that big of a deal, but for the Wizards to trade for Trey Young, that would be a very interesting move. Josh Robbins from The Athletic is all over that story. He will join us sometime during the show, probably in the 11 a.m. hour. Look, the press conference that ended the season yesterday with Adam Peters joining the fray for the first time since very early in the season, I thought produced, some notable quotes, some notable answers, none more notable to me in watching it. And I did watch it live right here from the studio and waited for it to get done before going after to a certain degree. But I thought that the Cliff stuff was the most interesting stuff because it came off the heels of the reporting over the weekend. And certainly the prospect of them moving on from Cliff. Ben on this show yesterday said he thought it was a 60-40 probability that Cliff would not be back as the offensive coordinator in 2026. Ben's going to jump on with us, by the way, in about 20 minutes to kind of go through that and some of the other things that were said during that press conference. But the Kingsbury stuff, to me, it started from the beginning. I think Nikki asked her question. It was maybe the second or third question of the entire press conference. And that was the answer. Anybody that was watching it or listening to it, you heard the head coach essentially not endorse his offensive coordinator, which was right in that moment. It was like, he done, more likely than not. And then the general manager didn't even partake in answering that question, even though Nikki asked it of both of them. Later on in the press conference, I think it was J.P. Finley who asked Adam Peters about his role remember, the Diana report said that it was Kingsbury and Adam Peters that were disconnected at odds. JP Finley asked later on in the press conference yesterday to Adam Peters what his role is in coaching changes. Here's what he said.
Sorry, DQ, that all the questions are for Adam, but we get to talk to you all
No
the
worries,
time.
man.
You guys talk about your comprehensive approach a lot. Adam, I'm curious, what's your role in the coaching staff decisions?
I'm really just here to support DQ. The coaching staff is DQ's, and I'm always here to help, like during the season and off season, however I can, to help support him and help him make the decisions that he needs to make, and certainly wherever he needs. So it's not, I'm not involved in whatever decision it is. It's always DQ's call, and I have his back on whatever he wants to do.
There's not silos here, JP, with coaching and scouts. We connect, we talk a lot, we visit a lot. And so it's one of the things I enjoy most is those conversations. It's different perspective, different points of view. So it's as collaborative as I've been a part of.
Yeah.
So there you go. First of all, that's the right answer from Adam Peters publicly. That is DQ's area, DQ's call, Dan Quinn's call. The coaching staff is. The head coach should have the final say-so on who is on his staff. And keep in mind, the staff that is currently here because of Dan Quinn more than anybody else. One of the benefits of hiring Dan Quinn was they knew that they could get an experienced and a high-quality staff. Now, many of you want everybody gone, but the bottom line is most people would view Washington's overall staff as a strong staff. They are here because of Dan Quinn, whether it's because of a relationship that they had with Dan Quinn in Dallas or Atlanta or even Seattle, or if it's just somebody that never worked with Dan Quinn but understood that working for him and with him was a good situation. Adam Peters did not really put that staff necessarily together. I think he answered the question in the right way. It should be Dan Quinn who's on the hook for good or for bad with the coaching staff hires and fires. Now, what Dan Quinn stepped in and said there at the end, I think is 100% true. It's very collaborative. What I don't know, and I'll just be very, candid on this front, and I've wondered about this and had conversations about this, is who in that collaboration ends up being the more influential voice? Is Peters able to weigh in on coaching, areas very influential in a very influential way? Is he able to sway Quinn, or, is Quinn easy to sway? Or is, Quinn the one that ends up with a lot more experience, certainly in a lot of different areas, the one that ends up carrying that conversation in their collaborative relationship more often than not? I don't know the answer to that. I think it's an interesting thing to consider because there are many times when I watch Dan Quinn, just, personal observation and being at least halfway keen in the human condition from an observing standpoint. Sometimes I think it's Peters that is the one that is really kind of handling the strings on this and pulling the strings on a lot of this. But I think he answered the question in the right way. As the general manager, you don't step publicly into an area after you've hired a coach and given him the autonomy to hire his staff and keep his staff together and make decisions with respect to moving on from staff members if that's what he chooses to do. So those were the two questions yesterday that really dealt in coaches, Cliff specifically. There were some questions for Dan Quinn about whether or not, he'd consider being, the defensive coordinator and what kind of traits they'll look for in a defensive coordinator, et cetera. We can get to some of those a little bit later on, but let's deal with the present. The present being, in their season-ending press conference yesterday, they were both given an opportunity to endorse Cliff Kingsbury, and they didn't. They did not. And that, to me, in the moment I heard it, said, he in trouble, big trouble. Now, how do I feel about it? I've told you how I feel about Cliff Kingsbury. I think it's an absurd conversation to discuss this season's failure as an offensive coordinator, problem. Now, there are two separate conversations. There's the conversation that some of you want to have, which is fire everybody, including Cliff Kingsbury. His offense, his lack of being under center is why they're 5-12, or why the offense wasn't as good as it was last year. And the other conversation is just a rational, much more rational, in my view, conversation that says, can they do better? Is there a better offensive approach for this team, for this quarterback? We know one thing is true without much debate. Cliff Kingsbury called and schemed up and ran an offense in 2024 that was elite level. No debate about that. You can jump on Jaden and say that's because of Jaden Daniels. In a lot of cases, it's because of the quarterback. Elite level offenses typically have elite level quarterback play. And Jaden was an elite level quarterback in 2024. But the system that was put into play, the way it was called, the way the pieces were used, best leveraged what Jaden was ready to do in his rookie season, and it paid off in a big way. I mean, look, there are some places in which if you don't win the whole thing, then it's a bad year. But here, no, it paid off big time. It paid off big time in so many different ways. They needed that. We needed that. 12 regular season wins, 2 playoff wins, which, by the way, one of them was decisive against the 1 seed, in which the team put up 45 points on the Detroit Lions. They got some turnovers in that game, finally, that helped. The takeaways helped in that game. And then, let's not forget that the Eagles' defense last year was historic in the Super Bowl. It was dominant, elite level, one of the best we had seen in recent memory. And the only team, really, the Rams did in the latter portion of the game in the snow against Philly. But the only team that had real success during the game offensively, moving the football and scoring points, was Washington. Kansas City couldn't gain a yard in the Super Bowl. Washington was moving the football up and down the field. They just turned the ball over too much in that game. And I'm not about to sit here and tell you that if they turned the ball over less, they would have won the game. They lost 55-23. I'm familiar with the final score. But they were much more effective against Philly's defense in their final 2 games against Philadelphia, the one in late December and the one in the NFC Championship game, than any other team, including a team that had Patrick Mahomes at quarterback. Cliff Kingsbury is a good offensive coordinator. He is. He may not be in that realm of what I like personally, the Shanahan style, more under center, which I think Jaden will thrive in if he gets into that style of offense. I do. I think Jaden would thrive in basically any kind of offense. But there are many different ways to get it done. I've mentioned this many times for the under center crowd, which, by the way, I'm part of. I prefer it. I mean, you guys know how much I love Mike Shanahan and how much I, on this show for the years that he was here, pitched that Kyle Shanahan should be the future head coach. And a lot of our fans wanted Kyle gone, thought he sucked. Same thing with Sean McVay. Same thing with Kevin O'Connell and everybody else that was here. Certainly, many of our fans picked the quarterback over Mike Shanahan in the staff during that era. I love Mike, still talk to him. And one of my favorite people that I've ever met from a coaching or player standpoint. That's my preferred way of playing football if it's my team. But Cliff schemed up an elite level offense last year. Andy Reid has schemed up some pretty elite level offenses over the years without necessarily being under center a whole lot. There are lots of different ways to do it. I'm wondering if that's the direction they're going to go in, and then who it will be. Because here's the bottom line, and this is where you can judge. As a fan, you can judge a franchise. Is if they move on from somebody like Cliff Kingsbury, they better have a better solution. You know, you don't just go moving on from people unless there's a real issue. And who knows, maybe there is. Maybe this disconnect between Peters and Kingsbury that Diana reported is just too much to overcome. Maybe it is. But here's the thing, man. When you move on from a guy that in 2 seasons schemed up an elite level offense in season 1, and in season 2 didn't have any players and still kept that offense halfway competitive, they finished essentially in the middle of the pack in most of the advanced, statistical categories. I mean, what he did with Josh Johnson over the final 2 games. You can talk about Philadelphia's backups all you want. Josh Johnson's a 39-year-old third-string quarterback. He had an 89.4 QBR in the game against the Eagles. And the Eagles' backups, by the way, are better than Washington's starters defensively. And they also played some of their starters on defense. Jomo, Jordan Davis, Nolan Smith, and some others were out there in that game. So you've got a guy that in 2 seasons, elite season 1, season 2, without any players, kept them in the middle of the pack of most offensive statistical categories. I'm not sitting here telling you that I loved every single thing about Cliff Kingsbury, because it's true. I was in here many a Monday saying, what are you doing? It's 1st and goal. Chris Rodriguez got you down there, and we're running tackle eligible? What are we doing here in Minnesota? There were other moments, too. I think back to week 2, Thursday Night Football, Lambeau. I mean, what are we doing dropping our quarterback back over and over again against that front 4 that we cannot block to save our lives? Can't we at least try to run the football? The score hadn't gotten so sideways in that game that they couldn't have tried to run the football a little bit. And when they did run it early on, they actually had a little bit of success. So, yeah, I'm net. If they end up with a solution here that ends up being equal to or greater, I'm fine with it. But I also would have been fine had Cliff come back. And it's not definite, I don't think, yet, but it certainly felt like it yesterday. That Cliff, when we had Dan Quinn not answer a simple question, what kind of job did he do this year? And then he took it as, what are you going to do with Cliff? No endorsement there meant, I thought in the moment, that's a problem. And when Ben had said to me yesterday, 60-40, he's not back, I thought that was a bit surprising, but Ben obviously knew something. Yeah, so here we go. The offseason that will be a crucial offseason for everybody involved. Last year bought you at least through 2026. There's no doubt. And look, in many ways, I think it easily bought them 2026 because 2025 was an aberration season because they were the most injured team in the league when it came to their top line players. That's just a reality. They don't use it as an excuse, nor should they. We're observers of the team. We know what happens when a team loses its best players. You don't have to look that far to see what happens when teams lose their best players. Look what happened to Indianapolis this year. When you lose your starting quarterback, you're usually done. The Brock Purdy, Mac Jones, citing as an example of is the aberration. It's not the rule. It's the exception, the major exception. What typically happens is what happened with the Colts. 7-1, 7-2, 8-2. They lose their quarterback and they don't even make the playoffs. They're the first team to ever go from 7-1 to a losing record in the history of the NFL. Washington went 7-1 in 1996 and finished 8-8. That was painful. But they did not end up with a losing record. But they did not make the playoffs either. All right. Ben Standig's going to jump on with us next. Kevin Sheehan Show, the Team 980 and the Team980.com.
Nikki Javal with The Athletic. This is for both of you. Just looking back over this past season, how would you assess the work that Cliff did with the offense?
Yeah, we're going through all the coaches, Cliff, offensively, defensively, on the teams wide, and so that's really what we're digging into, Nikki, to find what's best. How do we do it? Where do we find spaces to improve? And for Cliff, for Joe, for Larry, for all of us, like that's our main focus. So we're never in this space again, and that's what we want to dig in hard on.
Again, that was yesterday's season-ending press conference with Adam Peters and Dan Quinn. When I heard that answer, I thought, he in trouble, Cliff Kingsbury. Ben Standig is with us, our insider for the team. Ben told us here on the show yesterday that he thought it was 60-40, that Kingsbury would not be back in 2026. And I think it's certainly tilting big time in that direction after that answer. Ben had some really good reporting over the weekend on this, talking to league front office sources and people close to the situation that said that they were not going to be surprised if Kingsbury weren't back, even if he doesn't get a head coaching opportunity in this coaching cycle. Ben is with us at Ben Standig, of course, on X, on Twitter. Did you pretty much know when he didn't answer Nikki's question that this was probably going to end? I mean, or do you have a different view?
Yeah, I mean, you've mentioned the 60-40 thing, and, I tend to be a bit conservative on these matters because, ultimately I'm not in the head of the people.
I didn't think that was conservative in the moment, by the way, but go ahead.
Oh, okay. Well, in my own head, it was a little bit. But, yeah, I mean, again, let's just say nobody asked about Cliff Kingsbury. The story was out there. If you're going to, we see this in all the time in these circumstances. If something is out there that you just know is just complete garbage, you come out and say, this is complete garbage. Cliff Kingsbury is our guy. We understand, of course, he might get a head coaching job. And if he does, hey, we're happy for him, and that would be great. But other than that, we don't see why he's not back here as our OC. Last year was an unbelievable year, and this year he had a lot of challenges to deal with injuries. And by and large, he came through it, pretty solidly. There's things to fix, but we like Cliff. Nothing was said along those lines. Nothing. Forget that expansive. Nothing. Period was said about Cliff in a positive way. Not that they said anything negative, but they didn't say anything. And the silence in this case, I think, speaks pretty loudly as to where they're at. They're very aware of, they have a good PR staff up where these guys have access to the media. They know what's out there. So I think them not saying anything, I think, says a lot about what the situation is with Kingsbury right now.
It's interesting about the question. Dan Quinn could have said Cliff did a nice job considering what he had to work with. We had our best players lost for the majority of the games. That wouldn't have precluded him from moving on from him, but that would have answered the question and answered it pretty accurately. But let's move to, if this does happen, and I would be I was lower than your 60-40 yesterday. You were right, and I thought it was aggressive. But let's just say that this ends up happening. And I would bet big money that it does based on that answer or non-answer from the head coach yesterday. What would be the number one reason it happened?
I know that there was some notion that there's some sort of rift between Peters and Cliff Kingsbury, and when you throw that out there with zero context, it makes it sound like these guys don't like each other. I don't get that's the sense, but if you tell me there's philosophical differences, I think that is probably where this would get closer to. And I mean, it's not just with Peters. I would venture to guess Dan Quinn as well. You talk about, not you, but they talk constantly about complementary football and things like that. And look, again, the Kingsbury offense was highly effective last year, but sort of the nature of it being more of a pass-heavy approach, it is not necessarily complementary then, therefore, of a defense that struggled a lot this year, as we know, and did last year too. One of the reasons last year worked so well is the offense was able to control the clock a lot, but this year, a bit less so. Of course, injuries factored in. So and Peters, he came from San Francisco where the Shanahan system is, lives, and that system is, really predicated on the run game, kind of setting up everything else. And so, I can see how both Quinn and Peters would look at it and say, boy, you know what? I don't know if long-term this is where we need to go. Not to mention, does this offense put Jaden Daniels, does it expose him a bit more physically than we prefer? Of course, some of that's on the quarterback to get down and things like that as well. But to me, I think it would be on those matters. And I think something else I said to you, and we maybe slightly disagreed a bit on this a little bit, but, if you have and the coordinator leaves, there's a myriad of people who run a Shanahan system that you can look at. In this case, in terms of the heavy shotgun, no huddle, it is Cliff Kingsbury, and that's kind of it. Again, when the play breaks down, things all look the same in the NFL. But in terms of the pre-snap, yeah, it is very, very different. So if he were to leave, even on his own accord, then what? You probably have to change it anyway. So maybe they got ahead of it. Maybe they decided, hey, this isn't working for us. But I think it's more of that than any type of personal issues.
Yeah, I think I think I agreed with you on no huddle and on under center. To me, though, pace of play is also an important thing where they were kind of middle of the pack this year, in part because they needed to be. If they'd gone too fast, that meant the defense would be back on the field too soon. I did want to play this soundbite, and I want to get to some of the other stuff and your thoughts on some of the other things we heard from Adam Peters and Dan Quinn. But this was Adam Peters answering a question on kind of the plan to keep Jaden Daniels healthy long term. This dovetails off of a little bit of the conversation what you just said. I want everybody to hear it. This was Adam Peters on keeping Jaden Daniels healthy long term.
With Washington Post. Adam, is there a way to come up with kind of a long-term plan to keep Jaden upright and make sure he plays 15 or 17 games rather than 7?
Is there a way? I think really, and this might be a better question for DQ, but from me, I think is just continuing to, from my, from a personnel or GM perspective, is continuing to put good players around him. That's in front of him at the O-line. It's running backs to control the ball and control the clock and not put it all on his shoulders and get in second and third and manageables. It's receivers that he can trust and throw to so that he's not holding on to the ball longer. And so from my perspective, it's just getting good players around him, getting a good defense on the other side. So he's not, it's not all on his shoulders to win the game. So DQ can probably talk more schematically, but in terms of from me, I think those are the things that I can and need to do to help him out.
By the way, I think, when you hear about putting a supporting cast, Ben, around, a really good quarterback, that most people always just look at, all right, offensive line, receivers, backs, offensive players. What's really important to help a quarterback and an offense is not having an absolute wretched, terrible defense. He's that side of the ball for offensive purposes. I think it's just as important to fix that as it is to make sure they've got another receiver or two or another, back that's more explosive. If you think that that's a need, I don't think that's near the top of the list. But what did you make of that answer from Peters?
Yeah, look, as much as we talk about the quarterback and it is the most important position in American team pro sports and all that, yeah, it is not just it's not a one-man band, Nikola Jokic and all those guys in the NBA, they play both sides of the ball. In the NFL, Jaden Daniels is off the field when the defense comes. So you have to have it all. And obviously, it doesn't have to be the 85 Bears, but it can't be, it can't be the worst defense or one of the worst defenses in the league. And that was, when the season completely fell apart, it was getting blown out by at least 21 or more points in 4 consecutive games. And the defense was the primary cause of all that. But that said, one thing he said in that answer, I believe, is that he mentions, ways to help the quarterback include sort of with the running backs and controlling the clock. And again, it could be just a throwaway line, but interpreting what I'm already interpreting in terms of Peters it to me was a notion of, I think we need to be more consistent with the run. And again, if you hear criticism of Kingsbury's approach, it's that even there were games, there were times where he gives into the run, it just ultimately goes back towards, his broader philosophy of with the passing game. And again, I think I can see where Peters and Quinn would be like, hey, that's not sustainable for us for the long haul. So, yeah, I mean, again, it would be naive for anybody to say Cliff Kingsbury had all the tools at his disposal and this was the result. No. But the philosophy stayed. It did not really change a ton. Not kind of the Josh Johnson part of it, but the parts with Daniels and Mariota ultimately didn't really change a ton despite everything that was kind of, going wrong on both sides of the ball.
The irony of that, and by the way, I don't disagree with that. That's the one area in which I would say, yeah, I mean, like, I'd like to see, it be given more of an opportunity, the run game in certain spots. It's probably been, for me, the most criticism on, say, a Monday following a game that I've had. It's like, you should have run the ball at the goal line against Minnesota. You should have tried to run the ball a little bit more against Green Bay when you could not protect your quarterback against their front four and you didn't have anybody that could get open. And dropping back seemed like it was, a recipe for disaster. And yet, last year, the number 3 rush offense in the NFL, and this year, the number 4 rush offense in the NFL. Now, last year was too much about the quarterback, no doubt. We talked about it. You and I talked about it all year. Like, he can't lead the team in rushing 10 or more times in 2025 and beyond. That's not a good recipe. But this year, it wasn't about quarterback rushing. This year, it was about 2 backs in particular. That's just, it's an interesting thing to say. They got a real issue with running the football, and they were the number 3 rush offense, number 3 last year and number 4 this year in terms of yards per game rushing. And I think in attempts even, they're pretty high up there in overall rushing attempts on the season. I want to say they were top 10, in 8th or 9th, somewhere there.
My brain is fried here, but I'm pretty sure I looked up that, like, if you strip away the quarterback rush attempts, I think they were pretty low in the league.
In rush attempts.
In attempts, yeah. So I'm trying to look it up here really quick while we're talking.
I just looked it up. They're 9th in overall rush attempts. So where are they without quarterback attempts?
Yeah, if I'm doing this correctly on True Media, they are 22nd in rush attempts, not including quarterbacks, and both Daniels and Mariota obviously would take off a fair amount. And I think that was, you mentioned the productivity. I think that's where the frustration lies. We've seen situations here where the run game just isn't working, and you're like, well, you can say run the ball more, but it's just not working for whatever the reason. Here. Yeah. Look, again, I don't think anybody is looking at Ja'Cory Krosky-Merritt or Chris Rodriguez or Jeremy Williams-Nichols as having, Gerald Riggs and Ernest Biner for a Super Bowl team or whatever. Right. But yeah, they were effective in their own ways. And even beyond that, when you lose Terry McLaurin and you lose Noah Brown and defenses are starting to adjust because, oh, wait a minute, they have no downfield threat. Well, what do you have? And one of the, you had a couple tight ends and Zach Ertz and John Bates who can do, receive and block. But then you also have these running backs. And I know that going, say, 2 back sets is not normal these days, but you have to take advantage of what's on your roster. And the 3 running backs were by far their best options in many games rather than going Chris Moore, Robbie Chosen, using Luke McCaffrey and Jalen Lane in ways that they are not designed for, even having to use Deebo Samuel, out of the sort of a yak type of plays they wanted to because they didn't have other options. Like there are other ways they could have gone, I would think, and I would imagine Peters and Quinn probably ultimately felt as well.
Yeah, I mean, summing it up, I'll attempt to do it. Cliff Kingsbury has been a successful offensive coordinator, an offensive mind, and by the way, a respected one. And it's also true that Adam Peters and Dan Quinn just may prefer a different style of offensive approach, and they want to go in that direction. I mean, both of those things absolutely can be true simultaneously. And I think ultimately when I asked you why would this happen, that's the answer. They have a preference to do it a different way. Now, I would ask you, well, then why did they hire Kingsbury in the first place?
Yeah, no, I mean, to me, that's, I think, a potential indictment of the situation. Why do this? And let's also remember, Kingsbury was going to the Raiders. They had to come.
That's right.
They were trying to get him. They had to come back in and really, I guess, up the ante to make it work. So they were, extra aggressive in wanting him. And look, for the type of quarterback, I mean, they didn't know who they would have a quarterback at the point that they made that move. Although I guess they may have locked in Jaden Daniels by that stage, by early February. Already, but philosophically, Jaden Daniels works very well in the Cliff Kingsbury awesome. Cliff Kingsbury, going back to his days in college, working with Patrick Mahomes, is the quarterback whisperer talk for anybody is probably overstated, but he clearly had a good reputation in that regard. So, in that way, and also Dan Quinn said at the time that when he would go up against Cliff as a defensive coordinator, right, that he found his systems to be challenging. So, again. I don't think any of us, including probably Peters and Quinn, are saying, "Boy, this guy, he can't do this job." It's just that over time, having now seen it play out, understanding the coordinators, the play callers, quirks, habits, choices, whatever that may be, like, ultimately this isn't where we need to have this thing built for the long haul. And again, we've been embracing since halfway through last year that Cliff Kingsbury could leave. And, if that happens, they would have had to make a call on what to do next anyway. So maybe they're getting ahead of it. Maybe they're not. But yeah, these are the reasons why it is confusing as to why you thought something would be different, knowing Kingsbury had a strong reputation for the offense that he runs and all the things we're talking about. But, sometimes maybe you have to see it for yourself to really let it sink in as to what that's all about.
I mean, yeah, I think that last year happened. I mean, it happened. I can't erase it. And if I, were in a position of having any sort of decision-making ability, I would never hold this season against the coaching staff as the primary reason for 5-12. That's just not realistic in terms of the way it played out. But you could definitely go back and say, look, you had 2 years of bad defense, regardless of the people that you put on the field. And it didn't look like, even if you kept your best players on the field defensively, that it was going to be a very good defense anyway. Maybe it would have been slightly improved in a couple of areas from last year, but it certainly wasn't going to be a top half of the league defense, more likely than not. So why did you pick Joe Witt Jr.? And then, if you really ultimately came to disapprove, if you will, not of the results, but of the style in getting the results with Cliff Kingsbury, why didn't you know that before and go in different directions? And by the way, have to compete for and outbid essentially another team or two. I think it was more than just the Raiders that were interested in Kingsbury to get Cliff Kingsbury. All right. We're talking to Ben Standing, of course. So let's just assume for a moment that what we heard yesterday was a big tell on the direction that they are going to go in. Who's out there? I thought that Diana's last line in her report where she wrote, the Commanders likely won't make any final decisions until they see how the broader coaching market develops. Whether or not she got that from somebody else or that's her view, to me, any kind of decision to move on from someone who's had success, you better be sure you are going to replace that person with somebody who's as good or better. And so are there availabilities right now based on the first day post regular season that exists that you could see them making a move on? I mean, Kevin Stefanski, I think, is going to end up with a head coaching job.
Right. I mean, that's the thing. Like, even just to, like, on the defensive side, we're all saying, oh, Raheem Morris would be an obvious guy. He's already getting a head coaching interview with the Titans. We'll see where that goes. So yeah, we can't assume that any of these head coaches with coordinator experience are automatically going to be available as a coordinator. But yeah, Stefanski would be a very high end option for sure. When it comes to again, if Dan Quinn, and I guess and/or Peters. I mean, Peters said, "Hey, these choices are Dan Quinn's." I think that's another thing to note, that he's pretty, direct about that. I mean, you could point to whether it's San Francisco or Denver or all kinds of different teams that have had, either good offenses, or they have play callers, that are known to have a really good reputation. All these people, there could be people from these different spots that could jump in. I've been focused more on the defensive coordinator names because that was the one we knew about more than some of the offensive guys. So I need to maybe think a little bit more about where, but like it could be even sleepers, like a guy like a Davis Webb, who's I think gets a lot of credit for what's happened with Bo Nix in Denver, a Sean Payton guy, former quarterback, like a guy like that maybe is like off the radar, we're not talking about, but could jump in to the mix. Internally, of course, you have Brian Johnson, who he's part of the offensive staff now, but he was the OC with the Eagles for a minute. You have Anthony Lynn on staff, who's been an OC. I don't know if that's his direction I would necessarily go in, but they do have, again, some options on staff as well. But you're right. I mean, it isn't just, boy, we have to move on because this didn't work on any level. It's more of, well, if we do move on, then what are the better choices? And, you never know how these things are going to work, of course, but I don't think they're going to lack for guys that they can easily look at and say, yeah, this is a direction we want to go in. And, again, we just look at the teams in the playoffs, look at the teams with the bigger offenses, look at who is the person either under the OC or somewhere in that range. And you can probably find some people and say, oh yeah, that's a good target. So I would look at it just from that perspective. And the specific names will come out here, over time.
Michael LaFleur in Los Angeles is, I think, technically the offensive coordinator, but he doesn't call the plays. Sean McVay does. That's somebody in that, in that area. Obviously, if Mike McDaniel got let go, there's that. But yeah, very interested to see if this happens, where they would go. So let's update the percentage of it happening. Where are you now? Cliff Kingsbury's not back. Percentage chance he's not back.
Boy. I mean, unless we're, unless my initial instincts were wrong and now everybody's interpretation is wrong, I mean, 90%, give or take, feels about right. I mean, I mean, obviously, I mean, again, obviously,
it was an easy answer. It was an easy answer for Quinn. Easy answer.
Yeah, well, like I said, even if nobody had asked the question, I mean, Quinn he began the press conference by saying, we're not ready to answer any questions about the future, but ... We're, I know there's noise out there about Kingsbury, and we don't, that's anything in that direction is overstated or not true or something, or even just like, hey, we had a great year last year. This year injuries stunk. What, again, the things we said before. So yeah, they could have said anything about the guy in a positive way or any kind of defense, and they offered none of it.
All right. What else from the press conference stood out to you?
Well, where I am in the batting order, I get to hear a lot of the questions that go ahead of me, and some of the ones
Ben needs to be moved up in the batting order. Come on, man. Put him in that 3 or 4 hole. Go ahead.
Sometimes being later isn't so bad because you hear what their answers are, and you can maybe follow up on something, but whatever. Anyway, so a couple of the things I was maybe going to ask about, including did Adam Peters think they made a mistake by going with so many older vets this year? But that was asked. But as I was sitting there, I was thinking, what I have brought up on my podcast, on your show, on my Substack, in conversations with anybody who would talk to me about anything, that I could not understand the wide receiver room depth chart this year. It made no sense going all the way back to May. So I was like, oh, the heck with it. So that's why I was like, hey, Adam, could you explain what the plan was here when back in May you've got McLaurin holding out, you've got Noah Brown gets hurt in minicamp, you got both of them missing all of training camp, and I'm watching your practices and I'm watching your inter-squad scrimmage and your receivers can't get open. What was your plan? And I don't know that he gave us necessarily a great answer. He said that, look, that their injuries kept both of those guys out longer than I thought, and I think that's probably fair, right? I mean, obviously Terry came back after 4 games, gets hurt, goes out again, and Noah Brown wasn't initially placed on IR. Then after the injury continues to linger, then they put him on IR once and then had to do it again. So I get that, but still, where were the bodies? And he said that they did look some other moves. I know Kendrick Bourne was an option for them at one point. He went on to have a pretty good year for the 49ers. Woulda, coulda, shoulda, that didn't happen. And, I think to me, if you had to boil down where this season went wrong beyond injuries to a single aspect of the season, I think after they beat the Chargers in week 5 and then week 6, the Bears come out with this sort of, aggressive sort of man look, putting their corners in man and bringing the other defenders up towards the line of scrimmage, daring Washington to throw deep and outside, and then Dallas followed it up the next week. I think that was more or less the season. The offense could not recover. They didn't have the pieces to get it done. And, that may ultimately be more, again, on Peters than Kingsbury, because he's the one putting together the roster. Now, how much of that is based on what the OC is looking for? No, I don't know. But to me, again, Peters didn't give a great answer, didn't give a lot of specifics, but, he said, hey, we thought, they were out longer than we thought, and we did try to look at some other things, but, you got to weigh the price, and we decided not to do it. So to me, that was such a key to this season. I had to ask.
Yeah, they couldn't get anybody open offensively with their receiver depth, and they made up for it, but by not ever being able to get off the field on defense. What a wonderful season. By the way, you did ask him basically the tanking question. And we can go out on that, Max. I think it's number 22 on weighing in on sort of playing the younger players down the stretch. Ben asked that question. Thanks for doing this. We might be talking tomorrow about something that happens today. We'll see. Appreciate it.
Always, man. See ya.
Play Ben's question where Adam Peters.
And obviously, the front office is about looking ahead. The coach is about looking in the moment. When you guys are in the position where you're eliminated from the playoffs or the season's going a certain way, do you weigh in and say, hey, maybe we need to get some younger guys in to see what we have next year, or even have a discussion about, hey, if we win a game in the last week, it could affect draft status and the importance perhaps of that, even if you say we're not going to worry about that? Do you weigh in on those matters?
I told him the tank, and he just said no. No. That game was important. The game was important for us to win, so I'm really glad we won for a lot of different reasons. But in terms of just weighing in on personnel things, I think it goes back to what Q was saying. We talk all the time. We talk every single day, all day about how can we do better, and I'll make suggestions and I'll say, oh, that's a good idea, or no, this is why we won't do that. But I think that's a constant dialogue between us, and there's no, we have a great respect for each other. So if I ask a question, he knows where it's coming from, and it's not coming from a bad place. It's either coming from trying to get information or just understanding. So, but yeah, we're always talking about that, every single week, regardless of our record, always trying to. Sometimes I have ideas that I think are good and they're not. And he'll tell me why. And then sometimes they are good. So I think that's a healthy relationship that we'll always have. And I hope that, we'll continue to have.
Adam Peters yesterday on that. Adam Peters answered a question about Laramie Tunsil and the potential for a contract extension. He talked about Terry McLaurin looking back at the summer that was. He also, along with Dan Quinn, kind of went over their first 2 draft classes. And Adam Peters also discussed being in this position before. You'll hear that and a lot more when we come back, including, by the way, the performance of the night for any of our local teams. That's next. We'll get to Trey Young to the Wizards with Josh Robbins a little bit later on in the show. Keep it locked here. These are busy days when it comes to news related to coaches. We'll have all of it for you all day long on the Team 980.
And the Washington zone. Washington zone and a puck for Justin Sordiff. I mean, these guys are flying right now. Back to center. Here he comes again. Sordiff coming right up the middle. Across the Anaheim line. Dropped off to Van Riemsdyk. Center to McMichael. On across. They score! And it's a hat trick! Justin Sordiff! 3 goals for number 34. Oh, baby, it's 4-1. Washington, have a day. Justin Sordiff.
What an outstanding play. He cranks the whole thing, gets speed through the neutral zone, drops it off, and then a tic-tac-toe play. Ryan Leonard, what an unselfish play that was. Seeing Sordiff right in the middle. He could have shot that puck. Puts it over to him, right on his stick.
Justin Sordiff has 9 goals in his 3-year career, and 3 of them came last night. Good on Justin Sordiff. John Walton and company on the call last night as the Caps beat the struggling Anaheim Ducks 7-4 at Capital One Arena in a game in which Alex Ovechkin had 2 goals as well. Ovechkin's been on a bit of a cold streak. He had 1 goal in his last 14 games, but the Great 8 gets 2 more last night to add to what Justin Sordiff did, and the Caps back in the win column with a 7-4 win over Anaheim. You know, one of the things I do, because I'm not a big hockey guy, as most of you know, is I do, look at scores at the end of the night and standings to see where the Caps are and how they're doing. And what's really interesting is the Caps had lost, I think it was 6 of their last 8 going into last night's game, but they were only in 4th in the Metropolitan Division. With the win last night, they're tied for 2nd and only 3 points behind the leader. Joe B pointed this out to me, I think the last time he was on, which was right before the holidays. And he said, man, you look at the Eastern Conference and it's all bunched up. Like there is like 10 or 11 points max. And actually, as of today, there are 11 points difference in the standings between the worst team, Columbus, who's got 43 points, and the best team, Detroit, with 54 points. So that is tight. In the Metropolitan Division alone, you have 5 teams within 4 points of one another. So it will be an interesting season from that standpoint. Of course, I say that knowing, because I know very little about hockey, but I do know one thing, and that is playoff seeding, regular season record, throw it out the window. It's the most random of all of the postseasons. Anything can happen. All right. So, yes, I am going to give you guys a chance to weigh in on the phones. I do think that this could be a news day. We'll see. Look, it's a news day around the league. I mean, these first 2 or 3 days following the end of the regular season, you get a lot of news. The Cowboys are moving on from Matt Eberflus. They fired him today. So you had that in combination with the news from yesterday, some of which happened during the show, and Max was keeping you updated. But Jonathan Gannon got fired, I think, after the show, after 3 years in Arizona. Stefanski's gone. They're keeping Andrew Barry. Look, they've got some talent on that team, especially on defense. And then you had Pete Carroll get fired in Vegas. That, of course, followed Raheem Morris and Terry Fontenot, both coach and GM, getting fired in Atlanta. With, by the way, Matt Ryan, it looks like, taking over as president of football ops. He'll end up, being instrumental in hiring a general manager and hiring a head coach. And thinking real quickly, and I'm going to get to some of the other things that Adam Peters and Dan Quinn said during their press conference yesterday. But in thinking about the openings, I think the Atlanta opening is pretty intriguing. They actually have good players. They really came on defensively. The 2 players that they picked in the first round of the draft, remember, they traded back into the first round last year. And one of those players, James Pierce Jr., had a hell of a rookie season. They traded back into the late portion of the first round to take him after they took Walker at 15, the linebacker from Georgia. Both of those players had years. And then their third-round pick, Xavier Watts, the safety from Notre Dame, had a great year. They improved significantly on defense. And then you've got a team on offense that has Bijan Robinson, Drake London, Tyler Algier, a really solid offensive line. Kyle Pitts is an unrestricted free agent. It would not surprise me if Atlanta decides to move on and let him go in free agency. He's a talent, there's no doubt, but there's been, I think, a lot of frustration with him in Atlanta, the inconsistency, the true love for the game, etc. But he is a freak on the field. There's no doubt about that. But the quarterback situation, if Kevin Stefanski or a Clint Kubiak ends up in Atlanta, mark my words, there's a really good chance Kirk Cousins ends up being the starting quarterback next year in Atlanta for either one of those two guys, both of whom he's worked with before. Now, with that said, part of that is just because their starting quarterback, Michael Penix Jr., the injury that he had, he may not be ready to start the regular season next year. But that's an intriguing job. I think the Giant roster is a solid roster. You've got a question mark at the quarterback there, too, in Jackson Dart. The Cleveland job, I mean, you inherit a dominant defensive football team, no doubt. And by the way, Jim Schwartz has not been fired. It's very possible Jim Schwartz is going to be the defensive coordinator with a new head coach in Cleveland. But a lot going on. We'll keep you posted on all of the league happenings. So there are 5 or 6 sound bites that I want to play for you from the Adam Peters, Dan Quinn presser season ender yesterday. Very early question. I think it came from John Kime to Adam Peters about Terry McLaurin and looking back on the summer contract negotiation.
And Adam, for you, since we haven't talked to you in a little while, want to go back to the summer with Terry, given how the season played out for Terry, the injuries, the early struggles and all that. How would you assess how that situation was handled, and how can you apply whatever you learned to future situations?
Yeah, certainly. I think both us and Terry would agree that we would like to get that done a little bit faster. It didn't happen that way. Certainly, there's reasons for that, but ultimately you'd like to get those things done before we did. In terms of where Terry's at, I thought, obviously he got hurt early, but I thought he did a really good job at the end of the year. I was really pleased with where he's at, playing at a really high level right now and going into next year. So really pleased with the end result of the contract. Obviously you'd like to get it done earlier, and I think that's a good lesson too, just engaging in those things a little bit earlier, and hopefully you get to the to the end before we did on this one, and certainly we'll do that moving forward.
So there were a couple of parts to that answer that I found interesting, and I'll concede that part of it is because of how I felt about how the summer went. I was very much pro team, in part because I had some knowledge about how some of this was going down. And I think when he says at the very beginning of his answer, I think both us and Terry would agree that we would have liked to have gotten that done a little bit faster. Certainly, there's reasons for that. He's not going to come out and say, long after the fact, yeah, this could have gotten faster had Terry and his agent been, a little bit more realistic as to what they were worth rather than being, outsized delusional. And that's, I believe what a big part of last summer was about. I know many of you say, who cares? You weren't going to be productive without Terry on the field. So overpay him if you have to, but just get it done. Give him a contract that far exceeds his actual capability, both, past performance and future performance predicted, and let's just get it done. And many of you had that position. I did not share that with you. I thought it would have been a bad precedent to overpay wildly the market on a receiver who was going to turn 30 years old. And then I don't know if you caught it, but he slipped in to an answer, really pleased with the end result of the contract. Yeah, they were. The team would have liked to have gotten that contract, agreed to and signed 2 months earlier by Terry and his agent. But ultimately, they got the deal they wanted. Terry and his agent did not. But I also think it was, important for him to point out and to encourage and build up the fact that, the injuries aside, when he was out on the field, he was impactful. This turned out to be for Terry, it's a bad year because he did not get anywhere near the deal that he wanted to get. Understood. But in terms of how he was viewed based on performance this year, some might say, well, they were right. They predicted that once you turn 30, injuries are more of a probability. Okay, that's fine. But the games in which he played, especially when he came back, like the game against Kansas City, the 2 catches he made, the one on the sideline and the touchdown, to keep them in the game, when it was 7-7 at halftime. The game that he had against Denver in that Sunday night overtime loss. Quite honestly, the games that he had the last 2 games with Josh Johnson at quarterback, 63 yards on 5 catches in the Christmas Day loss. And then I thought he was the best player if Chris Rodriguez wasn't on offense in the Sunday season finale. He drew 4 defensive penalties that kept the offense on the field and also caught 4 balls for 57 yards. So, look, it was limited play from Terry this year because of the lingering quad injury. Ultimately, he played in 9 games and really, 6 or 7 of them completely healthy, start to finish. But there were moments that were memorable in a very positive way. So the negative is he didn't play enough. The positive is when he did play, certainly in comparison to what they were putting on the field, and that's not saying much, obviously, what they ended up putting on the field at wide receiver, it was so obvious that he was head and shoulders their best offensive receiver, and I would argue, the 3rd best offensive player. I think Tunsil now moves into that top 2 conversation. And next year, remember, that contract extension really is about a 1-year contract extension, 2026. For him to get the remainder of that contract and the team not to bail after the 26 season, he's got to have a great year next year. And that will be obviously contingent on health and contingent on quarterback health and health around the team. But the moments he had in the limited action he was out there for, I thought that they were memorable, and I thought they did him very well in terms of how he got viewed. So that was one soundbite I wanted to play for you. The next one was Adam Peters being asked about Laramie Tunsil, not just the acquisition and how he played, but whether or not they're going to get a deal done with him. Remember, Tunsil's got 1 year left on his contract. They traded a 2nd and a 4th round pick, this year's upcoming season's 2nd and 4th round pick. That's why they don't have a 2nd and 4th round pick. And they obviously have to get him signed to a long-term deal in this offseason. Here was Adam Peters on Laramie Tunsil.
Tom Shad with the Washington Post. Adam, I had a couple questions about Laramie Tunsil, obviously one of the big offseason additions. How would you evaluate kind of the impact that he had on the team? Have you had any talks with him, early talks about a contract extension? And did the situation with Terry kind of inform how you'll go about those potential talks?
Yeah, in terms of the evaluation, I think in his impact on our team, I thought it was really outstanding, both on the field and in the locker room. He's a great leader. I don't think, and he's not really upfront about it, but he's an outstanding leader. He's an outstanding mentor to the other old linemen. He's a really good teammate, and in a lot of ways that you don't really see because he's not looking for attention, but really just it's been really, really awesome to get to know him and to see how he goes about his business. Incredibly hard worker. And then on the field, I thought, he was one of the better left tackles, if not the best in the league. He didn't get recognition for the Pro Bowl, which I was disappointed in. But you look at the metrics, he did a great job. So that's all to say that we've had constant communication. He's self-represented, but he has a team around him that we have constant communication with and had throughout the year. So I think what I can say is we definitely want to get something done with him, and sooner rather than later.
Yeah, they have to get something done with Laramie Tunsil, and there's no reason to wait on that one. He was one of the 5 or 6 elite level pass protecting left tackles in the game, really top 2, 3 per a lot of the advanced numbers this year. There's no other way to look at the Laramie Tunsil trade, in my opinion. If you want to say, well, he's older and you didn't get a contending year in 2025 with him, and now you got to pay him big money and you don't have the roster to contend for a Super Bowl, so what was the point? I don't see it that way. I see the investment in what Adam Peters talked about, and we played that soundbite when Ben was on the show about investing in the quarterback, that Laramie Tunsil is not a player that grows on trees. You just don't go to the elite left tackle store and pick one. There are 4 or 5 or 6, 7 guys tops like Laramie Tunsil. And they got him, and they got him for a 2nd and a 4th rounder. I think it's incredible value that Washington got back. This was an outstanding trade. But to make that trade 100% through and through outstanding, you have to have him for more than 2 seasons. And you can't be faced with the potential franchise tagging of his 3rd season. So they will, I certainly would guess they will get a deal done. And I don't know what the process with Tunsil is in a contract negotiation. He's been through it. There's probably some information out there, and maybe it's self-representation and the idea that they were going to have to pay him that scared Houston away and had them move on from Tunsil in the first place. We will find out about how these contract negotiations go. Remember, we got our first real experience. I know they extended Cosme, but the first real high-profile contract negotiation for Adam Peters in the new front office was the Terry McLaurin situation. Maybe not the best to kick it off with in terms of the way it went, clearly, but number 2 is Laramie Tunsil, and that's going to happen here over the next couple of months. I would hope that they get something done before the season begins. I would put, the Tunsil trade and selecting Jaden Daniels as 2 massively impactful Adam Peters moves. There are others. I know some of you think there aren't. There are others. We've gone through the list before, and there are a couple of moves that didn't work out. Marshawn Lattimore, the kicking situation, which continues to be a question mark. All right, there's more that I wanted to play from both gentlemen. We'll keep you posted on any news. And I will be joined next hour by Josh Robbins from The Athletic to talk about the reports yesterday that Washington is a potential trade destination for Atlanta Hawks star guard Trey Young. All of that coming up on the show and more. Kevin Sheehan Show, the Team 980, theteam980.com. Don't forget, we are live on the Odyssey app. You can download us, listen to us whenever you want, wherever you are. And you can watch this show on the Team 980's YouTube channel. Hit the subscribe button and hit the like button when you get there. This from my guy, Hal. Hal writes, Kevin, you stumped for Kyle more than anybody in town. I'll give you that. But you jumped on Cooley's call on Sean, and you were lukewarm on Kevin O'Connell. Are you stumping for Cliff over DQ? Don't be afraid to do it. Sounds like you want to do it. Hal is one of those who often reminds me exactly what I said from many years ago. I usually have a pretty good memory of the things I get wildly wrong and the things I get wildly right. The in-between stuff gets a bit murky there, Hal. Yeah, of course. I mean, let me just start with this. You're right about Sean McVay. I mean, when Sean McVay was the tight ends coach, Cooley said he was going to be a head coach. He said he will be a head coach sooner than anybody understands. And the first interview he goes on to interview for even an offensive coordinator position, they're going to say, no, we want you as our head coach. So, yeah, no, I rode Cooley's coattails on Sean because remember, there was a year or two where it's like, is he really a good play caller? And Cooley kept insisting, no, this guy is the real deal. Cooley actually said, I think Sean should be elevated to head coach over Jay Gruden when Chris and I were doing the show together. And Hal, you're right. I was always lukewarm on Kevin O'Connell. I thought out of all of the dudes, especially the ones that I ever had conversations with either on the air or at the park, because back then I was at the park a lot. We had a studio there. I did the show there a lot. I always kind of felt that, guys like LaFleur and even Mike McDaniel, who I'll never forget, I had a 45-minute long conversation. He just kind of hung around the studio, walked in one day and introduced himself, and none of us even knew who he was. And I remember saying to, I think it was Tommy, I'm like, I don't know who that dude is, but God, he's smart and interesting and different, which he was. And I remember Shanahan, I asked him about him, and he said, oh, he's probably going to be a head coach one day. But you're right about O'Connell. Out of all of them, I never really saw it with Kevin O'Connell. Never. I'm not so sure people in the building were convinced about Kevin O'Connell. But all of what you said is true, Hal. I don't know why you're saying it. Now, stumping for Cliff over DQ, that's not what I'm doing. It's not what I'm doing at all. What I am saying is that I think those of you that believe Cliff Kingsbury is A, bad offensive coordinator, B, responsible or largely responsible for 5-12 are in blanking sane. I just don't agree with any of that. I think Cliff absolutely knows what he's doing. He's definitely an outlier in the approach, but not that much of an outlier. Yes, as Ben discussed, there aren't teams going at up tempo as much as Washington has over the last 2 years. But I want to emphasize that up tempo this year, it's two different things. Like up tempo is actually pace of play. No huddle's different from up tempo. You go no huddle more than anybody else. That's true. But Washington was in the middle of the pack in the NFL in pace of play, meaning how many seconds came off the play clock before they snapped the ball. They weren't snapping the ball at a super, fast rate per league averages. Last year they did. They were, I think, 8th in the league in pace of play. This year, I think I gave you the numbers yesterday. What did I say, 16th or 17th this particular season? And the truth is, the play designs, the play scheme, the offensive scheme, the, lots of screens, lots of, deception. That's not a unique style of calling an offense. As much as Andy Reid's style is different, but it's not totally unique. What's unique is the lack of under center, certainly as it relates to this year's numbers, and the no huddle. But again, if no huddle doesn't equate to fastest pace of play, then you're just trying to do it to get into a position where you have a potential advantage of keeping whatever defense was on the field on the last play on the field for the next one. And sometimes he would sub anyway. Many times he would sub even with no huddle. But no, I'm not stumping for Cliff over DQ. I'm not. And if Cliff goes, I want to be clear on this. There's a really good chance that whomever they hire, I'll be really excited about and intrigued with and think that it might be the right longer-term answer, because I do like Shanahan-style offenses more than any other style of offense. But I do not think that Cliff is a bad offensive coordinator, and I don't think under center, lack of it, was why they ended up 5-12. They ended up 5-12 and not nearly as good on offense as they were last year because they didn't play with the same players they played with last year. So thank you for that, Hal, and thank you for keeping track of everything that I've said over the years. But no, I'm not stumping for Cliff over DQ. I'm not. I think Dan Quinn deserves 100% next year. I do. And I don't think it should be a hot seat right from the beginning of the year. I think 2024 bought Dan Quinn at least through 2026. And again, 2025 isn't on him. It's not on Adam Peters. It's on the occasional carnage injury situations that happen with 3 to 4 teams a year. And it happened with Washington at the highest level this year. All right, a little bit more sound from yesterday's press conference. This was Adam Peters answering a question about cap space, free agency, the recent, shorter term deals, but all the cap space. Will there be more longer term deals? Here's what he said.
I know you guys have had a lot of 1 and 2 year deals in free agency, specifically your first couple of years here. Do you anticipate getting more aggressive with you guys having a lot of cap space this offseason? And then how do you balance that as a GM of, picking your spots to go with smaller with deals or maybe taking some bigger swings in free agency?
Yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with the opportunity and the specific players. Like I think with certain players, when we got here, we did a little longer term deal, three-year deals. That we haven't done much more than that, except for extending our own guys. But I think a lot of it depends on the player, the opportunity, and just how they fit. There's a lot of risk, I think, in free agency if you don't have a ton of familiarity with that. And in the past, places I've been, the biggest mistakes we made were investing a lot in a lot of years into a player you don't really know. So I think there's where you carry a lot of risk in making a big mistake. So we'll look at everything individually, but I don't think any of us have any aversion for doing the long-term deals. It just depends on the player and the situation.
Yeah, you think about the players that did in year 1 or year 2 get longer term deals. They weren't exclusively players that they had familiarity with, but many were. Bobby Wagner, Tyler Biotish, Dorrance Armstrong, this year Kinlaw. Yeah, but they also, they didn't have any sort of experience with Frankie Louvu. They signed him to a 3-year deal. Actually, Ertz was certainly somebody familiar with Cliff Kingsbury. But Ertz signed a 1-year deal, right? Yeah, they just re-upped him in the offseason. It's an interesting answer. It's not the first time I've ever heard a general manager answer a question about free agency with the level of risk involved when you don't know the player and you don't know what you're getting and you're not exactly sure ultimately how it will fit. And therefore, the resistance to give long-term deals that you can't get out of for a few years, risky, for sure. This was Adam Peters on, the number of draft picks that they have and how that will impact the way they handle free agency. Remember, they have 6 picks total. Didn't have the second and fourth. You'll hear him kind of muddle around on that part. But will it ultimately lead to, without a full cupboard of draft picks and without a second and a fourth rounder, maybe a different and maybe perhaps a more aggressive free agency approach.
Hey guys, JP Finley, NBC4 1067. Adam, for you, going into this draft with just 2 picks Thursday, Friday night, how does that impact how you approach free agency, whether it's more aggressive or a different approach than perhaps these last few seasons?
I think you always want to look at the overall landscape with the draft and free agency and understand where the strengths and the weaknesses are and use those to your advantage in terms of where you're going to really invest in one or the other. Obviously, free agency comes first, and then I wish it was the other way around where you draft first and you supplement with free agency. That's not the way it works though. But with only having, 1 pick, like you said, we have two. Yeah. Sorry. We don't have a second or a fourth, which, actually very happy that turned out that way with Laramie. I think I would do that one all over again. But obviously we have a top 10 pick, which, you could look to move and get more picks if the opportunity arises. But certainly I think every offseason, no matter what your picks are, what you have, you're always trying to maximize both the draft and free agency, getting guys that, you might not be able to get in the other one. So if you're going free agency, it's super heavy at one position, maybe you go there, and then the draft, you go elsewhere to fill those needs.
There's going to be a lot written over the next few weeks in advance of free agency, which will get started in early March. So over the next month or so, I don't think it looks like, a great free agency opportunity given how much money Washington has to spend. Some of the better players are some of the older players in the league, especially if we're talking about defense, right? Some of the better edge rushers are Trey Hendrickson. He got hurt this year. Joey Bosa, Khalil Mack, Hassan Reddick. I mean, those are the guys that are out there, names, people that you know what you're getting, but they're older players. Now, there are some decent corners out there, a couple of decent safeties, a couple of decent linebackers. I'm focused more on defense, but it's not like, I think we're going to look at this free agent class and say, wow, there are opportunities at every turn. The few opportunities there will be, remember, it's not like Washington controls who plays for them or who commits to them in free agency. I think sometimes we get caught up in, well, they could have gotten that player. Well, maybe they couldn't. Maybe they tried, but that player wanted to sign elsewhere for whatever the reasons are. It's free agency. It's not a draft. You're not picking a player that then has to play for you. You are competing for and hoping to outsell, outpitch competition for free agents. But it will be interesting to sort of look, at the list. Like if you look at any free agency list right now, George Pickens, Trey Hendrickson, the linebacker that signed with Philadelphia that they traded for at the trade deadline, Jalen Phillips, is an unrestricted free agent. I love him as a player, and he is, 25 or 26 years old. You've got, quarterbacks like Daniel Jones, who, is an unrestricted free agent. You do have a defensive tackle that's, approaching 30 years old, and Franklin Myers in Denver. And Alec Pierce, wide receiver from Indy, 25 years old, a 2022 second rounder. But don't you think Indy's going to do their best to try to keep him? Breece Hall's out there. So, yeah, it's not, those are like the top names I'm giving you, in free agency. You want a surefire Hall of Fame wide receiver in Mike Evans. He'll be available, but he's going to be 33 years old. Evans and Terry McLaurin would be interesting for a year or two. Max, I want to play the Zach Ertz 14 next because I thought this was an interesting answer from AP on evaluating the tight end room. I think you're going to hear from Adam Peters what you've heard from Dan Quinn and from Cliff Kingsbury many times, just how valuable Zach Ertz was to this team in 2024 and even through this year before he got hurt.
And Adam, I want to quickly ask you about the tight end position. Obviously, Zach's future is kind of uncertain right now. You're looking at the tight ends on the roster. How do you evaluate that and maybe add another piece in terms of a tight end free agency draft?
Yeah, so we have I believe 3 coming back under contract, which is it's Bates, Ben, and Yankoff. Cager's on the practice squad, and then obviously we lost Zach, which was a big loss. Zach's a Hall of Fame caliber player who's really, really excellent in the pass game. So I think just depending on how Zach comes along and coming back, I don't anticipate him being ready at the beginning of the season. But so you look and to develop and really utilize those 3 guys' skill set. And I think they're all really good players in their own right. Ben's developing a lot. He's gotten a lot better this year, and I think he's got another level to go to. John's one of the best blocking tight ends in the league, and Colson's kind of a jack of all trades, but an excellent special teams player for a tight end. So as you're looking at it right there, where can you find someone who's, really, really good on third down? Could it be one of those guys? Somebody can always get open that the quarterback can always rely on. Can it be one of those guys, or are we going to go outside, whether the draft or free agency, and get that? So, think of a Zach Ertz type of skill set where, Jaden knows where he's going to be, when he's going to be, and trust that he's going to catch the ball and make the play, which he did really incredibly for the last 2 years. And that's sorely missed for sure.
Man, they have loved Zach Ertz as a receiver for their quarterback and quarterbacks this year. And I think, reading between the lines, sure, Bates is a really good blocking tight end. I don't know if he's the best in the league, but he's a good blocking tight end. Ben Sinnott, hasn't proven to anybody at this point through, 2 seasons that he's at that Zach Ertz comfort level. Colson Yankoff is, completely different. But I do think, in listening to that answer, that, Zach Ertz is a possibility to return if he wants to play again coming off that serious injury. I mean, I don't know. Maybe it seems unrealistic. I mean, that was a bad injury, and he's 35 years old, and, the rehab and probably not being available for the beginning of the year. But, man, dude, did they get a lot out of Zach Ertz. Let's keep in mind, Zach Ertz had been injured for basically 4 of the previous 5 seasons he had played in Arizona and in Philadelphia, and had almost become largely forgotten in many ways. And then last year, on a team that won 12 games and 2 playoff games, he caught 66 balls and 7 touchdowns and was totally reliable for the young rookie quarterback. Even this year, missing the final 4 or 5 games, 50 catches for 500 yards and 4 touchdowns with a revolving, quarterback and receiver, roster around him. They loved themselves some Zach Ertz. There's no doubt about it. All right, there's 2 more sound bites from yesterday's press conference that I want to play for you, and I'll play for you when we come back. And then it's your turn, 301-230-0980. Whatever you want to say about what I think is or was a major tell on the Cliff Kingsbury situation yesterday when Dan Quinn was asked a simple question. How did Cliff Kingsbury perform this year? Actually, both Quinn and Adam Peters were asked, and they basically didn't answer it. Peters didn't speak at all, and Quinn didn't answer the question. That was, I thought, a huge, huge red flag as to Cliff Kingsbury's future here in Washington. So we'll get to that with you guys, 301-230-0980, or anything else that you want to talk about with respect to what Adam Peters and Dan Quinn said in their season-ending press conference. Phone lines are open, 301-230-0980. It's the Kevin Sheehan Show on the Team 980 and the team980.com. Window Nation has a great deal going on right now. It's a buy 4, get 4 free sale. Buy 4 windows, get the next 4 for free. Plus, if you choose to finance the purchase, you don't have to put any money down. You don't have to make any monthly payments, and you won't pay interest for 2 full years. So your first payment on essentially half-price windows, if you buy 4 or more, will come in the year 2028. Replace your older windows with newer windows, newer insulated, high-quality, custom-built windows from Window Nation. Window Nation's installation crews will finish the job in a day or less. You can enjoy the rest of the year, the rest of the months ahead with minimal disruption. They leave your home looking nicer than it was when they arrived. Your windows will protect and beautify your home. You can choose from over 1,500 styles and colors at Window Nation. And Window Nation offers a lifetime warranty on everything you purchase, so you can relax knowing your home is protected far into the future. If you've been thinking about this, all I ask is give them a shot. Give them a shot to come out. It's no cost. It's convenient for you whenever you want them to come out to give you a free in-home estimate. Start that process now by calling them at 866-90-NATION, mentioning my name, or going to windownation.com and doing the same. We'll take your calls here in a moment, but there were 2 more sound bites that I wanted to play from yesterday's season-ending press conference. So both were asked about the last 2 draft classes and for them to kind of evaluate the 2024 draft and the 2025 draft. Here they were answering that question.
Good evening, Candy Waller, Bowie TV. And this is for both of you all. When you take a look at your draft classes, so last year and this year, how well do you think they're doing? Are they right where you think they would be right now, or have they exceeded expectations or not so much?
I can start, Candy, on that. Adam and I visited with a lot of them over the last, 2 weeks or so. And I love some of the trajectory that some of them are on. The belief that we have in them is so strong. And so that's kind of what your first and second year is. It kind of goes up and it goes down. I wish development was just like going straight up. That would be awesome. But what I can say is, like, we've got some really good, strong foundation pieces of what we're building that are commanders that play it the right way. And like to see them develop and grow, like that's one of the things I love the most about our team and where they're headed.
Yeah, I would echo that and just say, there's a lot of really young players that still have a great future ahead of them. So there's guys that haven't had as many opportunities as others for whatever reason. And a lot of times it's because there's good players in front of them, but we still have a ton of belief in all of them. And they all have another level they can go to, every single one of them. And they're all willing to do that. So very happy with the young men. And like you said, some have developed faster. Some have had their ups and downs, and that's okay. We all do, especially when we're first starting something. But in terms of all that, I have a ton of belief in all those guys.
It's really hard to do this. We've talked about it many times for many years about trying to evaluate a draft a year after it or 2 years after it. Some of you want to evaluate it 3 or 4 games into it. They've drafted 14 players, this regime has, in 2 different drafts, 9 the first year, 5 this year. There's essentially 2 players who haven't, contributed on the field much, one of whom is gone, Dominique Hampton, the 5th rounder from the 2024 draft, and then Kane Medrano, other than some special teams play and a little bit on the field, not much in terms of opportunity. Of the other 12 players, you can make the case that 7 to 8 of them are more than just intriguing, but they have a chance. And that would be ultimately after we get through next season and you've got 3 full seasons to judge the draft, hitting on 7 or 8 out of 14 would be an incredible hit rate. Just saying it, it's very possible at the end of next year, it's 3 or 4 players that ultimately really turned into contributors. But right now, you can name 7 or 8 that have either contributed at a high level already or are at least in the ballpark of being a potential meaningful contributor. Jury's still out. Last soundbite that I wanted to play from yesterday's presser, Dan Quinn and Adam Peters' presser, was the final question. I've talked in not relation to this team necessarily, although it's been sort of ancillary to this team, but many people have called in to say, man, the injuries that you keep referring to, what about this year's Niners, man? They've had so many injuries, and here they are, a really good team. And I've pointed to the fact that, yes, it's true, but it's the exception to the rule. It's the aberration. It's typically what Washington suffers through when you have – we've got breaking news?
We do have some breaking news.
Kind of
according
thought
to Ian
this
Rappaport.
was a possibility. Go ahead.
Yep, Ian Rappaport. The Washington Commanders and offensive coordinator Cliff Kingsbury are parting ways, sources say, as the play caller looks for a new opportunity. After a meeting with Coach Dan Quinn, Kingsbury will be an OC again this cycle, but also should be considered as a head coaching candidate.
Yep, there you go. Kingsbury and Dan Quinn, Adam Peters and company parting ways. Doing this the day after the season ender presser means you'll get statements, but you won't get Q&As for a while. So we'll see how, we get answers to why this happened. But there you go. There was a major tell. Obviously, we had the reporting from Diana Rossini over the weekend, Ben Standig over the weekend. And then, as we opened up the show, to me, when we heard Dan Quinn barely answer the question about just how did Cliff do this year, that was certainly a big indicator that this was a possibility. The team, I'm sure, will be sending out a press release, and when I get it in my inbox, I will read it to you. But as Max just said, Ian Rappaport, the Commanders, and offensive coordinator Cliff Kingsbury are parting ways, sources say, as the play caller looks for a new opportunity after meeting with Coach Dan Quinn. Kingsbury will be an OC again this cycle, but also should be considered as a head coaching candidate. Phone lines are open. I've kind of given you my reaction on this, anticipating that this was a probability, certainly a possibility. But your turn next. Kevin Sheehan Show, the Team 980 and the Team980.com.
Nikki Javal with The Athletic. This is for both of you. Just looking back over this past season, how would you assess the work that Cliff did with the offense?
Yeah, we're going through all the coaches, Cliff offensively, defensively on the teams wide. And so that's really what we're digging into, Nikki, to find what's best. How do we do it? Where do we find spaces to improve? And, for Cliff, for Joe, for Larry, for all of us, like that's our main focus. Like, so we're never in this space again. And that's what we want to dig in hard on.
That was yesterday. It was a big tell, a big red flag. The news just broke. Ian Rappaport, I believe, from the NFL Network had it first, that Cliff Kingsbury is out. They have mutually agreed to part ways. In addition to that, he does believe that Kingsbury will be an offensive coordinator this year, if not a potential head coach. But also, just breaking moments ago, Adam Schefter reporting, and this, of course, is not a surprise at all, that Joe Witt Jr. has been turned loose as well. So Washington is in the market for an offensive coordinator and a defensive coordinator, all in the same coaching cycle. This could have been easy from my standpoint. I can only speak for myself to run it back with Cliff in 2026. I think it would have been very hard to do anything with Joe Witt Jr. And I think, if anything, they were too late to the party on that. With that said, these will be two critical hires. You've got to find the right offensive coordinator for not just the offense as a whole, but really it's got to fit with the quarterback. Now, my belief is that almost any offense would fit with a quarterback talent like Jaden Daniels. But I am interested to see the direction they go. Are they going to go with something that Adam Peters was more familiar with in San Francisco, a Shanahan-style guy, a guy like Mike LaFleur, who is currently the OC in Los Angeles, but Sean McVay calls the plays. But could you give Mike LaFleur, Matt LaFleur's brother, an assistant head coaching position / offensive coordinator to make sure that it's an upward move? I guess you could. Defensive coordinator, Kevin Stefanski, by the way, out there, as I mentioned. I do think that he's going to have an opportunity to be a head coach. There's certainly a lot of discussion about two jobs in particular as it relates to Stefanski, the Giant job and the Atlanta job. So the offensive coordinator, Shanahan style availabilities aren't the greatest number that we've ever seen. I mean, Clint Kubiak looks like he could be a potential head coach as well. Seattle's offensive coordinator, part of the Shanahan, Kubiak, Kyle Shanahan, Sean McVay, the whole tree. It just continues to branch out. Defensively, we've talked about this a lot. If Raheem Morris got fired, which he did, but keep in mind, Chris Shula, the defensive coordinator for the Rams, is going to be a hot head coaching candidate in this cycle as well. So if Sean McVay loses Chris Shula, he might bring Raheem Morris back. Raheem Morris was the defensive coordinator on their Super Bowl team in 2021. So Raheem Morris, Washington or, Sean and the Rams. So he may not be available, even though he and Quinn are very tight. Jeff Ulbrich, the defensive coordinator in Atlanta, worked for Quinn in Atlanta as well. Al Harris worked for Quinn, the DB's coach in Chicago. Those DBs led the league in interceptions and takeaways this year. Al Harris is a big candidate for a defensive coordinator position. Matt Eberflus just became available. Eberflus has had a tough couple of years. There was a period of time, especially when he was in Indianapolis, that people around the league thought he was an outstanding defensive coordinator. It's not easy when you take the best defensive player on your team a few days before the regular season begins and trade him, see Micah Parsons. And then you've got a guy like Jonathan Gannon, who got fired in Arizona. Jonathan Gannon was the defensive coordinator in Philadelphia when Shane Steichen was there after, they had gotten to the Super Bowl and they both got head coaching jobs. Jonathan Gannon is, perceived to be an outstanding defensive mind. Jim Schwartz might be staying in Cleveland. I can't imagine personally on the offensive side that they moved on from Cliff without a clear vision, and not only a clear vision, but in terms of the probability of landing that person being a reality. That would be my guess. They don't seem to be super impulsive. And unless I'm really missing something, because again, I'm not sure, and Ben came on and said the same thing, that, that this was like an untenable situation between Adam Peters and Cliff Kingsbury. I don't think that that's ultimately it. I think what it is they have a different idea of what they want the offense to be. Remember, too, Cliff Kingsbury's off that Arizona salary, which he was collecting for the first 2 years here in D.C., the head coaching salary after he got fired as the head coach in Arizona. And it's very possible that to stay on, Cliff wanted a lot more money. I've not presented that into the conversation. I wish I had mentioned that with Ben. I can text him on that. But, Washington's, the Kingsbury salary has been picked up a lot by Arizona in these first 2 years here in Washington. And perhaps for him, he had the idea that after 2 years, he wanted to make his way back to a head coaching opportunity, whether it was in college or in the pros. Look, the college opportunities are all completed. So that's not happening in this particular offseason. We'll see whether or not he gets, some love in Vegas, Tennessee, possible openings for a Cliff Kingsbury. They certainly wanted him in Vegas a couple of years ago and thought they had him in Vegas a couple of years ago as the offensive coordinator. So this will be, the priority here in the offseason. I know many of you are going to want to be focused on free agency and number 7 overall. The top 2 priorities right now are OC and DC. And why is that? Well, because Quinn's become, for better or worse, subjective, more of a CEO coach. He needs clearly an offensive coordinator. That's not who he is. Is it possible they could look at Anthony Lynn, who's on the staff? They could look at a David Blau, who's on the staff, a Brian Johnson, who's on the staff and was previously a coordinator in Philadelphia. I think I wouldn't exclude anything as a possibility, but to move on from Cliff, my guess is there's somebody that they are targeting. So we'll see. And we'll keep up with the reporting. But there you go. 301-230-0980. Let's start with Sean in D.C. Sean, go ahead. You get to swing first on now the official news that Kingsbury and Witt Jr. are gone.
Yeah, hey, Kevin, and I do have to say that's a bit of a turn for me, because I was going to say, how is Joe Witt still employed by this team? All this talk about Kingsbury, but why don't we just clean up the easy stuff and get rid of Joe Witt? But fortunately, with my nimble
we
mind,
knew that was happening.
Here,
we knew that was happening.
Sure, but do it. Dan Quinn, the leader, go ahead and lead. So to me,
well, they did it within 48 hours of the regular season, ending. I mean, if you wanted it done during the regular season, that's fair. But I think at that point in the season, what
just
was
saying,
the point to turn them loose then?
Sure. So a couple things here. So I would just say that this, to me, weakens the argument that injuries were the biggest cause of this thing. Now, of course they were, but it reduces the impact of it, because Dan is saying, hey, I mean, at least to Joe, he's saying you didn't coach him up well enough. This is a you problem. This is obviously the injuries were obviously the number one impact. But if that was a 70% chance before, now it goes down to 55. Of course, I'm making that up. But this is an indictment of how these players were being coached, which kind of leads me to the next point. I ran a business. You were a CEO of a business. You had investors. If the CEO, his first 2 vice presidents he hires 2 years down the road says, yeah, these guys aren't going to work out, what are the investors thinking? They probably are thinking, hey, did we hire the right CEO? That's not a crazy thing for me to think.
No, it's not. It's not. I mean, unless those in that particular business, Sean, you would agree, unless those two people that you hired were so good that they got head coaching opportunities, that would obviously be different.
Sure. Sure.
But yeah,
I
I hear you. It does not reflect well on Dan Quinn that after 2 seasons, the offensive coordinator and the defensive coordinator that he chose are gone, and not necessarily for better opportunities. Certainly it's the case with Joe Witt. Now, back to what you said about the injuries, I still think, defensively, they could have been coached up better. I don't know if it would have helped ultimately, but offensively, to me, in looking at this season, Cliff got a lot more out of very little. I mean, they did not suck offensively in most of their games. They really didn't. Now, there were some hellacious defensive teams they faced. Seattle, that was a disaster offensively. Minnesota, that was a disaster offensively. Green Bay, early in the season when they were healthy, that was a bit of a disaster. And Detroit, by the way, who was pretty good defensively in that moment of time, was a bit of a disaster defensively, offensively. But for the most part, he got chicken salad out of, a bunch of practice squad players and backups for much of the year. So I think without question, the offense wasn't anywhere near what it was in 2024 because of number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4 injuries. Defensively, I've said this many times, injuries were obviously impactful, but I think in looking at the whole of it, it wasn't going to be a good defense. And it was a disorganized defense in a major way, especially when Joe Witt Jr. was the defensive coordinator. Cade in Bethesda. Cade, go ahead.
What's up, Kevin? I just wanted to kind of push back, not even on the Cliff stuff, but the Adam Peters having 0 role in the outcome of last year. I think he honestly kind of balked at free agency last year, right? We had a defense that wasn't very good in 2024.
You're saying after last year. You're saying this past offseason.
This past offseason. I think that he did nothing to fix a defense that got 55 points dropped on them. There were names out there like Josh Sweat. He kind of replaced mediocre players with mediocre players, like Chin with Will Harris or Fowler with Wise. And I think that his draft class that you kind of painted a pretty picture of isn't very good. I mean, if we remember the main,
I didn't paint a pretty picture. I just painted a realistic picture. The jury's out.
The big draw to us in 2024, right, was 5 picks in the top 100. You look at it now, there's only 2 players starting out of that, and it's Aiden and Mikey. Mikey's had 1 good year, 1 down year, and we traded out of that Cooper DeJean pick to trade back and get Mikey. And I think the other pick we acquired, we took Coleman. So
yeah, I would just push back a little bit on that, just so I don't lose the thought. Coleman and Sandra and obviously Jaden. So 3 out of that, 6 in the top 100 were significant to a run to the NFC Championship in year 1.
I agree, but
that's half of those players.
Coleman, he immediately traded for Tunsil and then picked up Connerly in the first round of the next pick and tried to move him to left guard, which I think was a little ambitious.
Right, but he's still a contributor, and he's a decent player and a versatile player for them. Provides them at the very least with depth.
Yeah, he provides them with depth. I agree with that, but it's a 3rd round pick, and depth is. I don't think that's a solid outcome. I don't think it's anything special.
I would agree with that. It's a solid outcome, nothing special, but it's not a terrible outcome.
I don't think seeing so 2 years later. 2 of those players are starting, and Mikey's had 1 great year, 1 pretty mediocre to down year. And I think every single offensive pick he's had in the draft, outside of Connerly, hasn't helped Jaden at all. I mean, we took a 2nd-round tight end, a 3rd-round wide receiver, and a 4th-round wide receiver. I don't think anyone sees Luke or Jalen Lane becoming like bona fide wide receiver 3s, wide receiver 2s on
Agreed
this
on
team.
that.
We've seen
Agreed on
nothing
that.
out
But
of
I
him.
think taking Jalen Lane as a 4th round, potential very good to great punt returner is worth it.
I think it's a fine outcome. I mean, that's a 2nd, a 3rd, and a 4th rounder that's going towards tight end and wide receiver. And
That's
one
all I'm
believes any
saying.
of them
The
are gonna be
outcomes
anything.
potentially could be fine in a lot of cases. And hitting on
understand.
basically 36 to 37% after 3 years is successful. I'm just saying that, Cade, there's a chance that at the end of next year that they'll hit on 36 to 37% of those 14 picks. So we'll look at them, and it won't be 3 years for the draft class this year, but it will be for the 9 that were taken in 2024. And if they hit on more than a third of them, it was solid to successful.
I see that, but I think hitting on a third of them is assuming the best outcome. And I think you also got to remember where these guys got taken, because 7 of them are
That's
top
fair.
100 picks.
I agree with that. Totally agree with that. So,
Yeah, so I just
Jaden
think
and so out of Jaden, Newton, Sandersstill, Sinnott, Coleman, and McCaffrey, they got a hit with 2 significant contributors out of those 6 typically on a draft overall. Top 100, I'll give you 3 out of 6, a 50% hit rate. They need 50% of those guys to be meaningful contributors. That would be solid. Anything above that would be great. Anything below that wouldn't be great. Now, to the first thing that you talked about, and that is they didn't do enough defensively in the offseason. The opportunities have to be there too. I do think right now that, number one, had Myles Garrett actually been on the trade market, they would have gone after him. Number two, they were interested and they did have discussions with Cincinnati about Trey Hendrickson. Number three is Dietrich Wise actually was exactly what they were looking for, not necessarily as a pass rusher, but because they had so much of an issue setting the edge against the run in 2024. That's what he was brought in to do along with Dorrance Armstrong. And I do think Kinlaw was a much better signing than I thought it would be for the money. And I think he'll be a significant player. There just has to be more around him. And he's got to play his position. He and Payne ended up playing, out of position over the last half of the season because there was no Wise and no Armstrong. And Martin couldn't be, an 80% snap guy. But yes, defensively, it would have been nice had they done more. I'm not so sure they didn't try to do more and that it wasn't just, there for them. Because in free agency, it's not, you're not picking, you're pitching. Is Cade gone?
He is.
We moved on from Cade. All right. Good call, though, Cade. Appreciate it. Lap in D.C. Go ahead.
Hey, what's up, Kevin?
How are
hey,
you,
Happy New Year to you, man.
You too, man.
Yeah, man. I'm just disappointed, man. This is just like a joke, man. Like, I get the injuries, you know what I'm saying, and I agree with you on that, man. But underneath the surface, and I agree with you of Cliff. I like Cliff. I thought Cliff did a fine job with, house money pretty much, what he had to work with for real. He didn't. You know what I'm saying? We had the injury, so he couldn't really work with who he had to work with. So that's what it is with that. But I'm just saying this team is a joke. I just feel like Dan Quinn, like, he's on a hot seat with me. And I told you I was iffy on him when we hired. I told you and Brewster, and I've been on it from day one. But we had a great year last year, but look at the last 5 years. He gets punished with being a defensive coordinator 3 straight years with Dallas. We got destroyed last year in the NFC title game. And then this season here is just bad, man. So he's got to do something. And then we got to go in year 3 when we're supposed to be developing any of our draft picks to hit on any of them. Get some talent around this team for JD5. JD5 also got to stay humble, but he needs to protect himself and learn and grow too as well. And then we need an offense and a defensive coordinator going into year 3. Like, this is crazy, man. And everybody gets mad at the fans, Kevin, for what we see, these normal trends with this organization. No matter if Daniel Snyder was here or who we got here now. We're seeing the same thing.
Lap.
change.
Okay, thanks. Couple things. Number one, like when you refer to this as a joke, it's almost like you didn't participate in the last 2 decades. Like you don't know what funny is. Funny was 24 years of Dan Snyder in terms of joke. This is not a joke. We have competent ownership and front office compared to what we used to have. We also, within the last year, not in the last 10 years or 20 years, within the last year, 11 and a half months ago, we're in the process of winning 2 road playoff games and moving on to the NFC Championship game, in which essentially all I saw, social media-wise, call-wise, was let AP cook, DQ, home run, hire. This year was a miserable year. There's no way of getting around it, but they didn't have players to play the season. Now, with that said, the fact that he hired Joe Witt Jr. to be his defensive coordinator and Cliff Kingsbury to be his offensive coordinator, and after 2 seasons, both of them are gone, that's on Dan Quinn. Okay, I do think Adam Peters participates in the process, but I think he was right to answer the question yesterday that this is the final say-so of the head coach. This is on Dan Quinn's record, the hiring and firing of coaching staff members. He's got 2 coordinators, both who were around for last season, which did happen, and were around for half of the season in one gentleman's case, the other the entire season, and now he's going to replace both. These next 2 hires for Dan Quinn, let me be very clear on this. They better work for him, and they better work quickly, because that, as much as anything else, is, and really almost everything else, is the one area in which criticism is deserved. This is a defense that has stunk badly for 2 years, had a first-time defensive coordinator who seemed to have a defense that was disorganized, miscommunicated, and to his defense, also lost a lot of players this year and didn't have a lot of players last year. But beyond that, Quinn, who, by the way, let me just correct you, Lap, his defenses in Dallas did not stink. In 2 out of the 3 years, they were number 1 in the NFL in takeaways and top 5, top 10 points allowed, top 5, top 12, 13 in overall yards. His defenses did not stink. If you want to point to the final game in Dallas when they got run over by Green Bay, not a good outing, that's for sure. But as I've pointed out, like if you're really going to get into Dan Quinn and you're really going to get into, the playoff stuff and the defense, they played the 49ers, Kyle Shanahan's 49ers, twice in the postseason before they ever got to that Matt LaFleur game and got run out of the building. And they were outstanding defensively and just lost 2 defensive battles in the postseason. You can't just nitpick or just, isolate one instance. Now, it's more than one with Shanahan-style offenses because we've seen what's happened here, just this year. I mean, it started early in the year with, Zach Robinson and the Atlanta Falcon game. Shanahan-style Zach Robinson came from Sean McVay. And then we got what was next? We got Clint Kubiak in Seattle, destroyed. We got Mike McDaniel, Miami. They actually played well defensively that day. Even though Miami moved the ball up and down the field, they were 0 for 5 or whatever in the red zone. And then we got, of course, Kevin O'Connell and what happened there. So, yeah, they have struggled with those offenses for sure. But, yeah. All right. Next call. Cyrus, Hyattsville. Cyrus, go ahead.
Happy New Year, Kevin. I was literally looking at Twitter while I was calling in, and I was getting ready to complain that they hadn't fired Joe Witt, so I had to calm down for the past 5 minutes.
Well, I mean, I think did anybody actually think that Joe Witt Jr. was going to be the defensive coordinator next year or even be on the staff? I mean, I think we've known that for a while.
No, No, yes, and you've alluded to this, that they probably should have made the change after the first year, because most of us knew that, at the very least, he wasn't good. All right, we can blame injury all we want for last year, but I think we all know deep down, based on 2024, that he wasn't good. As far as Cliff Kingsbury goes, I don't think there was as much of like a, butting heads rift as more of like a philosophical rift between them, if there was one. I think it's kind of like what you've been saying throughout the year, seeing Jaden take power QB runs into the end zone, into piles. Probably, yeah, and I don't think Adam Peters loved it either. And I'll just say this to be quick. In 2023, we were receiving reports that, in the case of the Eagles, Nick Sirianni, Jalen Hurts weren't getting along. There were rifts somewhere between there. They replaced both their offensive coordinators, or both their coordinators, and then won the Super Bowl the next year, if I'm remembering correctly, right?
Wait, say that again. I missed that. I'm sorry. Say that one more time.
The Eagles at the end of 2023 replaced both coordinators, and then won the Super Bowl the next year, amidst a whole bunch of turmoil, right?
Right.
Amidst the collapse. Now, I'm not saying we're the Eagles. They definitely have a better roster than us at the time. But I think we all knew deep down this particular scenario was coming. It just feels weird the way it all played out. I think once that subsides, because it's the only conversation we're having about our team right now, I think we'll get back to business as usual, making the most important hires. And Kevin, you are right. Getting good coordinators is almost just as important as getting, star players in many, many aspects.
Well, you need both,
and
we certainly saw examples of that. I think, and thanks for the call, Cyrus. Appreciate it as always. The Kingsbury thing is definitely strange. The Joe Witt Jr. thing is not. That was a given. That was obvious. We have been talking about Joe Witt Jr. going back to last regular season. Like, they're terrible on defense. Why? By the way, I'll stick with what I've been told with respect to the defense, over the last 2 years, that it was a lot of things. It wasn't just one thing. But, man, they were disorganized and had major miscommunications that led to one big explosive after another during the course of the early portion of the season, for sure, and the mid portion of the season. So that to me was a given. The Cliff thing is that, look, if they don't agree stylistically and they want to move away from, what Cliff does and does successfully to something else that's done and done successfully, I'm fine with that. I will repeat it until I'm blue in the face. I actually prefer a style of offense that is different than the way Cliff Kingsbury coordinates his. But I also recognize that Cliff Kingsbury knows what he's doing and is a good coordinator and actually coached up this offense this year into something that maybe it shouldn't have been. Didn't happen on defense. All the losses on defense, they didn't, make chicken salad out of chicken, on defense. He did it to a certain degree, including, amazingly, in the last 2 games of the year with a 39-year-old third-string quarterback out there. So I am surprised about the Cliff thing, but I am counting on, I hope, a solution that, strikes, oh, okay, I can see that. Because I do think that there's some possibilities for a solution where for those of us that believe Cliff would have been fine coming back, would say, okay, I'm fine with that. With that said, they better be right. Dan Quinn's got to be right on these 2 hires. I mean, it's a big part of his future beyond 2026. All right, I see everybody on hold. Stay there. 301-230-0980. We'll take a few more calls when we come back. Kevin Sheehan Show, Team 980 and the team980.com.
I'm good. I'm healthy.
And then there's been a lot of talk about Cliff, his future here with the head coaching job or whatever. What have been your thoughts on him as a coordinator and just, in the offense?
I mean, I love working with Cliff. Me and him have a special relationship. We kind of built that over his past 2 years. I kind of just wish I was out there more to play for him this past year. So, I mean, that's kind of the focus for me in this offseason is just rebuilding myself from the ground up and, hopefully go out there. And that's the most important thing, to be available for my team.
Jaden Daniels yesterday talking about how much he likes Cliff Kingsbury. If you're just tuning in, Cliff Kingsbury and the team have parted ways, and Joe Witt Jr. was fired as well. Washington in the market for a new offensive coordinator and a new defensive coordinator, the latter of which we knew was going to be the case. The former, not so much before the weekend of reporting. I do wonder, in listening to Jaden, I wonder if they will consult him. I wonder if he'll be involved in, at least meeting with potential offensive coordinator candidates. I'm trying to find, links with, Joe Brady was at LSU, but that was with Joe Burrow, not with Jaden Daniels. A friend of mine texted me, the perfect fit is Mike Kafka, the current interim head coach in New York, the Giants taking over for Brian Daboll. What about Brian Daboll? But with respect to Kafka obviously weaned on Andy Reid and the Chiefs in that system, and they're similar, to what he just played in with Cliff. I'm not necessarily a huge Kafka fan. I think you got to look at, Rams. You got to look at even a place like Jacksonville with Liam Cohen, who was part of the Sean McVay group in L.A., their offensive coordinator is this guy, Grant Udinski. Grant was in Minnesota with Cousins and with Kevin O'Connell. They've got a quarterbacks coach on that staff, Spencer Whipple. Spencer's father, Mark Whipple, was a longtime head coach in college at UMass, a multiple-time coordinator at places like Nebraska and then in the NFL with Cleveland. He's a real offensive guy. Interestingly, he coached under Cliff Kingsbury in Arizona as, an offensive pass game coordinator. So, you can think about some of the bigger names, the Kevin Stefanskis, the potential of like a Mike McDaniel if he were let go, or, even a guy like Mike LaFleur in, LA, where Sean calls the plays. But it may be somebody that they are eyeing off of a Jacksonville staff that's won 8 straight games, that is the Shanahan style, offense and tree. And look at what Liam Cohen and company have done for Trevor Lawrence this year. So a lot of ways to go with this. Let's get Paulie on. We've missed Paulie the last few days. Go ahead. I know you're thrilled.
Hell to the W, man.
What's
Come
up?
on,
Happy New Year.
that's a little over-exaggerated. Same to you, man. Happy New Year. That's a little over-exaggerated, man. I wouldn't say thrilled, but, like you said, we knew what was going to happen on defense. And so that's not a surprise. The only thing I'm really surprised about with Kingsbury is that Quinn actually pulled the trigger on this. But you look at it, man, we talked about this. Somebody had to be the scapegoat for what happened to Jaden Daniels this year. We said it during the season. We questioned it after the Green Bay game. We questioned it after the Seattle game. We said this. A lot of callers, what he did is a fireable offense. Somebody should be fired. And so what this tells you, inside that building, they didn't just blame injuries as an excuse. They looked at it as a schematical deficiency too. And if you watch the offense, regardless of who was in there, who was at quarterback, it was the same offense from last year. The offense didn't evolve at all. We didn't switch anything up. Kingsbury came back with the same offense, and the defenses were ready for it. I've said it all year long. Around the league, they said we're not going to let 5 beat us. If 5's in the game, he's not going to beat us.
Well, 5 wasn't in the game, barely. So we're talking about Marcus and Josh and, 3 complete games start to finish healthy in a quarterback, and they had mid-level league results offensively by every advanced measure.
And even early in the season, when he was healthy, you could say teams they didn't want Jaden Daniels to beat them.
Well, one of the best defenses in the league this year couldn't stop him in the Chargers.
Who was that? Come on, man. Listen. I'm not saying that the offense was completely inept.
Okay,
right? But
good, because that would be ridiculous to say.
I remember, Sheehan, I've been saying it all year. I didn't mind Kingsbury coming back, the running back for the 3rd year, but he had to make some type of changes. And obviously, he was stuck in his own way. He didn't want to make changes. I mean, it got to.
Maybe we would have seen changes, Paulie. Maybe had they had their players out there, we would have seen a bunch of changes. But there wasn't really an opportunity to see. They were trying to get enough players healthy and eligible each week.
You proving my point right there.
How am I proving your point?
Because without these players that you keep wanting to say injuries was happening to, Kingsbury still never adjusted his offense to the strength of the players he had out there. It was still the same shotgun, throw.
Well, that's because Marcus Mariota was most comfortable in shotgun. And they, as mentioned, were the 4th leading rushing team. I agree with you. I didn't feel like they were a great running team. I'll concede that. But they were number 4 in the league, and it was mostly running backs this year, not quarterback, rushing yardage. They were 9th in the league in rushing attempts. Yes, you had a lot of quarterback scrambles in there, but your narrative isn't backed up necessarily by facts. That's the only issue I have, even though in many ways your instinct and what you're saying matches up with what I thought I was watching at times, that they didn't run it enough. I think, let me just say this. I think the play calling 1st and goal at the 1 or at the 2-yard line against Minnesota, I think that was a level of frustration, and you heard it in Dan Quinn's voice after that game, that Monday following the game, and Cliff fessed up at the end of that week and said, I didn't call a good game, called some bad plays. Anyway, you got 20 seconds with me because I got to move.
That's my whole point. He never adjusted the offense to the strength and weakness of the offense. It was the same thing over and again, and that's coaching, man. And if you can't move off
again,
that,
with hardly anything, they had middle of the pack results. I mean, that's just a fact. You can say he didn't adjust anything. Maybe if he adjusted, they would have been an elite offense without the quarterback. I don't think you believe that, or I believe that. I got to run. Just DM me. So Josh Robbins covers the Wizards for The Athletic. I had him scheduled to come on. There's a big story out there that the Wizards are going to trade for Trey Young. You'll hear from Josh next. Trey Young to the Wizards. How real is it? Joining us right now is Josh Robbins. He covers the Wizards for The Athletic. You can follow Josh on X, on Twitter, at Joshua B. Robbins. So the news got out there last evening. I know The Athletic was part of the news cycle on Trey Young to the Wizards as a possibility. How real do you think it is?
I think it's a plausible scenario. The Wizards are open to taking on money, especially if it means that they get a draft pick or a young player in return. I would think that would be the central element of any negotiation with the Atlanta Hawks. What kind of pick or picks are the Hawks willing to give up to convince the Wizards to take on Trey Young's $49 million player option for next year? And I would imagine that's the center of the conversations the Hawks and the Wizards appear to be having.
What would go back to Atlanta, Josh?
Well, it would have to be a rough salary match. So C.J. McCollum would be the most obvious part of that deal, in part because C.J. McCollum has helped them win games this year. So there would be a benefit to moving off of C.J. because he has played well for the most part. But there would have to be additional salaries going out. I would think that Cam Whitmore could be in play there. That would be a possibility, I would think. But that would be, you'd have to find approximately, I'm just doing some arithmetic in my head, approximately $15 to $18 million worth of additional salary to make this work.
If Trey Young came here in a deal with, let's just say, a draft pick or another young player with some control, is that a move that ultimately ends up being Trey Young's a cornerstone piece of a contending team 2 years down the road?
I think they're a long way from contending. I think they're more than 2 years away from contending. But your question, is he going to be a cornerstone piece? I have to be straight with you. I would not know. I would imagine. So Trey Young's agent is participating in this process, as has been reported now by multiple outlets, including mine. I cannot imagine a scenario in which any acquiring team has not discussed, what would it take to re-sign your client after his player option ends. I would think that they would have to have some idea in mind about what could be negotiated on and what Trey Young's camp would be willing to accept, and that would have to go into their calculus. What the part that confuses me, and I think might confuse the Wizards, is how would he fit with this team? In which case, there's a plausible scenario in which at least the first half of the 26-27 season would be used, and potentially the rest of this season, if Young would play, to determine how does he fit. Do these guys who are on the team currently, do they like playing with him?
Right.
Would he make sense for a team that already has shown very little success in defending aside from at the rim? So these are all the considerations that have to be weighed. And there would be a danger in the Wizards coming to a conclusion on that for the long term before they've given it a test run.
Yeah, I mean, look, when I said 2 years from contending, I meant 2 years away from trying to win and trying to, contend for, a 7 to 10 spot in the East. I'm certainly not expecting them to be, a championship contender in 2 years. But I think what you just hit on is where I'm, struggling. I don't know where the fit is. He's a 6'2" player that likes to dominate the basketball and shoots a lot. Like where do you see that fitting in long term, or is it just They bring him back. They eat this salary for a couple of years. They get another young opportunity with a draft pick or a player, and he's gone in 2 years.
I think the thing that you and I would have to remember here, Kevin, is that the people going out in the trade don't fit into the Wizards' long-term plans. Almost whoever it is. Like CJ McCollum on an expiring contract. The matching salary almost certainly would not be a young player whom the Wizards are enamored with. So that's issue one. Anything that anyone, and I say anything in terms of the contract that the Wizards would give up, that's not a long-term loss other than not using those contracts for a different deal in this cycle. As to how he fits, well, okay, yes, he does shoot a lot, but he also has a tremendous amount of gravity on the outside. So opponents would bring two to the ball, which means that if you're patient on offense, you'll eventually get an open shot. And in terms of Alex Sarr, well, if Clint Capella could become a dangerous lob threat in the roll game, imagine what kind of threat in the lob game in the pick and roll Alex Sarr could become. That's how I view this. In terms, yes, he'd be a net negative on defense.
Yeah.
But offensively, I think he would have the potential and really the likelihood to help create a lot of open shots for teammates. Now, whether they would like to play with someone who dominates the ball, that's a whole other question that's more than fair to ask.
Is there star power with Trey Young or not?
Yes, in the sense that it would finally bring some buzz to a franchise that has, at the moment, zero buzz.
All right, I want to finish it up with this, Josh. They've been playing well. They've won 4 out of their last 6. Do you think there is any threat of this team playing well enough to where they end up risk losing their first-round pick to the Knicks, which is protected if they finish in the top 8 of the draft order? Are you concerned? Is anybody there concerned that they're playing too well right now?
Yes, I would imagine that they would be concerned if they don't take some sort of action to kind of cool off this hot streak in time, not necessarily immediately, but in time before it's too late to correct. So to guarantee there's no chance of conveying that pick, the Wizards have to finish in the bottom 4 of the league standings. If they have the 5th worst record, there's a margin, very, very small chance that somehow they can drop to 9th in the draft order. But I cannot imagine this front office being so imprudent that they would allow a scenario to come to pass where they give up that pick. They're just much too smart for that.
Everybody, I hope you understood what Josh just said. If they finish with one of the 4 worst records in the NBA this year, there's zero chance that the draft lottery could produce a draft order where they're picking 9th or later. If they pick 9th or later, they lose the pick. If they pick 8th or earlier, they keep the pick. If you finish in the worst 4, worst case, if you have the worst draft lottery luck, you're going to pick 8th, not 9th. If they finish outside of the 4 worst teams in the league, there's a chance that they could end up with draft order pick number 9 or worse, which means they would lose the pick. That would be organizational malpractice if that happened. Interesting season from that perspective. Josh, thanks for everything. Hope you're well.
My pleasure.
Josh Robbins, everybody. We're done. Joe Witt Jr. out, but the bigger news and the bigger story, Cliff Kingsbury out. Chris Russell next.